Welcome to part 2 of creating my Wonder of the Ocean microlearn. My name is Emma Berry and I am an e-learning developer and instructional designer. And in this part, I am going to take you through how I created my imagery, the sizing I used, how I positioned things on the page to create this kind of seamless scroll effect and seamlessly embed imagery into my microlearn. So when kind of coming up with the idea for this microlearn, I knew that I wanted it to be quite visually striking and to include as much media and sort of imagery and graphics as possible. But I also knew that would be quite tricky in terms of it looking good between devices. So let's take a closer look at this header image here and start to delve into the different sizes I used, the software I used, and how I created this effect. So if we stick in Rise for now, I'll just show you how the images translate across different devices. So we'll focus on this header image here for now. And if I go to desktop, then into tablet portrait, tablet landscape, and then into mobile views, you'll notice that this image scales really nicely across devices and nothing is cut off or missing. So this is the first thing that you're going to have to pay attention to when either using imagery or creating your own custom illustrations. Another thing to note whilst we are in Rise is that I didn't set this image, so this ocean image, as my microlearn header. So the header of my microlearn, or the cover photo I think it's called, is just a plain blue rectangle, the same color as the sky in this ocean illustration. Now, the reason that I didn't set my ocean illustration as the cover or the header image is because this text here, where it says the title of the microlearn, cannot be switched off. You can't take that away. And what would have happened is this would have then been across the top of my image. It also doesn't give you as much flexibility in terms of the way that it looks if you set it as the cover image. So I decided to keep this cover image just a plain blue rectangle and to have my ocean illustrations, kind of the introductory illustration, as the top image. So let's jump into Affinity and I will walk you through how I created this image. Okay, so here we are in Affinity Designer, and this is the software that I used to create all of my illustrations, but you could use any other vector-based illustration software like Adobe Illustrator. So the first thing you'll notice about these illustrations is that they are all vectors. So I drew these and you can see the complete sort of image is made up of loads of different individual parts. Now, the reason that I chose to do it this way and not use kind of various different JPEGs or PNGs is for the scalability of it. So I exported this image as an SVG, which is a scalable vector graphic. And what this does is mean that I could sort of scale my image up or down without losing any quality. So vectors can be scaled up massive amounts and still retain a really good quality, and the same the other way. So I knew that when trying to find the right size for my image in Rise and have it translate across devices really well, I'd probably have to play around with the sizing. And if you're doing this with a PNG and mainly with a JPEG, you can reduce the quality and get images that come out quite blurry. So that's the first thing to kind of consider with this, is how big your sort of starting image is and whether you're going to need to scale it up or down. So the second thing when creating my illustrations is I focused on using a limited color palette. I am a huge fan of limited color palettes. I think they reduce kind of cognitive load. They're less sort of jarring on the eyes, and it makes the whole thing look very cohesive, because I wanted this kind of very seamless one-page feel with the Rise course. The limited color palette was key in kind of achieving this sense of everything being tied together. So for this one, it's two shades of blue mixed with an orange and a yellow. And I always try and incorporate a brighter, sort of higher contrast color if I'm using more muted tones like dark blue. And you'll notice we've got this turquoise color as the sky, which is the one that matches the cover image in my Rise course, which again helps to create that cohesive scroll with no blocks or lines or differences. So sizing for this one. So this header image is 690 by 300. So 690 wide by 300 deep. Now, as I said, I did a lot of trial and error with sizing, and it works for this. Not saying it would probably work for everybody. It probably depends on what kind of image you're creating or what the sort of image you're starting with. But this sizing seemed to work really well for me in terms of it looking good across devices. So that's 690 pixels by 300. The next thing to consider when using imagery and making sure that it translates well across devices is what you want the learner to be focusing on, what is detrimental that needs to be viewable on the screen. So in my case, it was this phrase here which says the ocean. I knew that this bit needed to be visible regardless of what device the learner was on. When you're using text, you don't want words or the letter, to be cut off and it's something completely not what you want it to say. And again, this took a little bit of trial and error, but as a rule of thumb, I would say keep any key kind of visual components in the center of your image. When I first created this illustration, I actually had the phrase on the left-hand side here, and there was a image of something on the right. And when I put it into Rise, that was when I came across the problems of the N getting cut off or it missing bits of the word, and it just did not look good. So try and keep things as central as possible. Now, appreciate if you're working with existing imagery, if you've downloaded a PNG from somewhere, then this might be a bit more tricky. But I would suggest creating yourself a blank canvas in the right dimensions that you need, and then moving the image around the space so that the key feature of the image is in the center. So this is how I set up a header image, and the purpose of this image was just decorative. I had the title in the top of the Rise course, so this was just to kind of introduce it and to be something that grabs the eye and draws somebody in. So now let's have a look at the sizing I used for my dividers. So another way I used imagery in my microlearn was by creating these dividers. So we've got a static image one here, and if I scroll down a bit further, you will see that we have a moving one here, which is a shark. And the reason for this was just to break the space up a little bit without it feeling blocky. So because the background color of this divider blends in with the two blocks above it, it looks very seamless. It doesn't look obvious that it's there to break the space up. And the same with the shark as well. This was just a nice way to go between sections without having to use a really boring kind of like static line. And again, you can see here to introduce the midnight zone, we've got our well. So let's jump back into Affinity and we will look at the sizing for these. So we are back in Affinity now, and here is the illustration for one of my dividers. And again, you can see this is made up of lots of different illustrated components. And we've got the same color background as the background in my Rise block. Now the sizing for these was around 2000 wide by about 400 pixels deep. So these are slightly wider. And the reason I did this was because I knew that with this particular divider, it didn't necessarily matter what parts were on the screen per device. So this is a purely decorative image. And because it's got the little fish just sort of swimming along, it didn't really matter whether somebody on mobile view was seeing just this section and maybe somebody on tablet view was just seeing this section here. So I allowed it to kind of be a little bit wider. And with this one, when you do switch between devices, you will see that I think on mobile view, this sort of section gets cut off, and I think this section gets cut off. But because it's illustrated in that particular way that there's nothing vital for the learner to see, it doesn't look out of place. If I open up one of the other dividers, so let's just, here we go. Now this one is the same sizing, and I wanted it to act as a bit of a sort of section introduction. But with this one, as with my header image, I had to make sure that this particular section with the animals and plants text was in the center. Again, as with the ocean one, I actually had this phrase written out across in one sort of line across the bottom here on the sand. And when I put it into tablet and mobile, it started to cut off some of the lettering. So instead, I opted to keep the text central and then make these outside bits decorative. So it didn't matter. I think in mobile view, you just get the text and all of this is cut off, which doesn't matter. It's not detrimental to the image. So with these dividers, depending on what you're using them for, just be conscious about if you're using this particular sizing, which is sort of 2000-ish by 400, things on the outer edges will likely get cut off on the different views. So if you are using it for a kind of header or something that has any text in it, then just keep that central as well. So that's the second way I used images in my microlearn. And I won't go into the animations with the shark and the GIF because that's a whole other thing. But that was created using an online GIF software. You just illustrated the shark and all the different frames and then just put it into a like automatic GIF making software. So let's have a look at the third way I used imagery and jump back into Rise. Okay, so finally, the last way I used imagery in this microlearn was to create these decals, I suppose you could call them, which introduce the different zones. So we've got one for the sunlight zone, the twilight zone, and the midnight zone. And these were embedded as text and image blocks. So for the header and the dividers, these were full width image blocks. And to avoid any white lines or boxes around the images, I just reduced the padding right down to 0. And that means you don't get these kind of white lines between sections. So for these, they are embedded as text and image blocks. And if I go onto the settings, you can see I've taken the padding right down and I've reduced the image size to 50%, just because it was absolutely massive otherwise. And that's the good thing about inserting images in this way, is you can reduce these images a little bit to fit your page. I also got rid of the zoom on click, just because people don't need to zoom into this. Again, I've got the actual name of the zone on the right hand side here. This is purely decorative. And again, as with all of the other imagery I've used, I've ensured the background is the same color. Now this one has a gradiented background, and this is actually embedded into the Rise course, into the Rise block. So this is an image, and all I did was create a rectangle using the similar proportions to the dividers of just a blue gradient. And then when I was creating this sunlight zone image, I did it with a transparent background so that it would blend really seamlessly into the background behind it. And again, these are all vector images. They're all created in Affinity Designer, which means they were able to scale up and down really seamlessly with no reduction in quality. And then when I came onto this block here, I just set the color to match the end of that gradient to create that seamless scroll. We've got the same here. So this image for the twilight zone is a SVG with a transparent background, which meant it could seamlessly sit on top of the background and the same down here as well. Now I'll quickly jump into Affinity just to explore kind of the sizing of these images. But with these ones, I found that because you can change the percentage sizing of them in Affinity, in Rise, sorry, it didn't really matter what sizing I used. I mean, the bigger your initial canvas, the bigger these will appear on screen. So it all depends on what you're using this particular block for, I guess, or how much text you've got on the side. What I found was if I did these images too big, then because, for example, on this section, I've only got like 2 sentences of text, it made the text look really strange because it had so much blank space and this huge image. So if I quickly put this back up to 75%, you can see the image is like shoving the text out the way. So just be a bit mindful of that. If you're using the image like I have as just a kind of decorative decal type thing, and you're not going to have a lot of text next to it, then I would keep your image size on the slightly smaller side so that it's not overtaking the text. But let's jump into Affinity and I will let you know the sizing I used for these. We are back in Affinity to have a very, very quick look at these decal illustrations. So the first thing to note about this one is it has its transparent background, which, as I said, allows it to blend in with the background. The second thing with these is the sizing. So this decal is around 1100 pixels by about 700 deep. And the reason for this sizing was because of the text. So this one was originally a lot bigger, something like 2000 wide by 1000 deep. And when I put it into the text and image block, it was cutting off the S and the T on sunlight because the image was just way too big for the confines of the Rise block. And as with creating the other images, to get the ideal sizing really was just a complete process of trial and error. Once I found sort of a sizing that really worked for me, I was able to then translate this across for the Twilight and the Midnight Zone decals as well. So with these ones, it's a little bit different because Rise will automatically kind of move it around and resize it based on the devices. Because it's embedded in a Rise block with text, it will shrink and sort of expand your image based on which device the learner is using. But again, a rule of thumb, as with all of the other images, anything that's important, keep it in the center. With this one, I've been able to kind of stretch the text out across the width because I've messed around and played around with the sizing to make sure that it works. But it is just a continuous process of having Rise open, having your illustration software or your photo editing software open, and resizing things, embedding it in, checking it across devices. If you're not happy, trying it again. To very, very quickly sum up key points, if you're using images in your Rise course, ensure that anything you need your learner to see is central on the screen or the center of your image to ensure that things aren't being cut off as you switch between different devices. If you want your images to kind of blend seamlessly into the background, you can either create images with a transparent background or you can match the background of your image to your Rise course as well. If you're using text and image blocks, just be mindful of your image size. If your image size is too big, then certain bits can get cut off, which if it's an image that doesn't have anything sort of detrimental to learning on it, then that's fine, but just be mindful of that. And in terms of sizing, just play around with what works best for your content and your level of text and the microlearn in general. For dividers, you tend to want something that's quite narrow and shallow. For sort of decal style images that are going to sit with text on a text and image block, go for a more square based image, so like 1000 by 1000 pixels. And for large header images like this, you want something that's maybe around 1000 by sort of 900 deep. Where possible, try and source the biggest size of your image if you're using a PNG or a JPEG, because you're going to want to be able to sort of scale up or down to find the suitable size for your microlearn. And if possible, use SVG, so scalable vector graphics, because these scale up and down really nicely and will often not reduce in quality either. And there we go. I hope that has been helpful and inspired you to have a go at creating your own kind of graphic and illustrated RISE course.